I know you have a doctorate in French literature, and I think you deserve a doctorate in economics, because I know you've really researched and worked in telling us about the crash of 2008, about alternatives like public banking. And then today I've really worked on memorizing your long title, The Role of Women's Unwaged Labor in the Historical Process will be Betsy's talk. And thank you for doing that.
And I really hope that you do this next year. And one of the big gaps in our programming for these, well, I guess it's been about 10 years now, has been focusing on women's issues. So I'm so happy that you did that this year, and that you brought in a lot of younger people and Mexicans into the whole process. So we will keep that going. And in the summer, we also have a series of movies and documentaries and talks in July and August. So if anyone would like to participate in the planning for that, we've got the time slots reserved, and so we need to just fill in the program. So anyone who will be here, just let me know, okay? Because Cliff's not going to be here, so I can't do it all by myself. So we'll need some help. I'm sorry about this long academic title. Bob said to me, "Oh, for Pete's sake, can't you give it a jazzier title than that?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, right, sorry, forgot." But what I want to talk about, I've said in the historical process of, instead of saying during the development of capitalism. And anyway, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Do I need a microphone? I
Turn the mic around.
That's okay.
But your face is in shadow. I don't know how well the camera picks you up.
We know who you
You
are.
have to stand back a little further for the.
Oh, that's good.
That's
good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Is that better for you? Okay. So I'm going to try to, I can't possibly match Laura Carlson and her talk from the other day, her presentation. Although I will, next year I will try to have a few pictures for you. And maybe I'll learn how to do a PowerPoint presentation. But I'm honored to be here at the end of this whole month, and I can't tie it all together, but I'm very happy to be able to add something at the end. The organizers of the San Mujer have introduced us to a new Eve in an old Garden of Eden. They've introduced us to women standing up to brutal suppression of their reproductive rights, to a happy mother-centered village in Oaxaca, to first-wave feminists who got the vote only after risking their lives, to the woman who woke us to the threat to life on Earth, and to a champion in fighting the drug war that brought us Ayotzinapa and more. Summing up his vein, so I'll just go with the flow. I'll argue that the struggle for socialism, and socialism understood not as a system, but as a process, as a movement beyond capitalism that defines itself as it unfolds, is not wedded to the struggle for the liberation of women, and men too, of course. I've always thought that the women's movement was for men as well as women, but it is part of the struggle from oppressive gender roles. We won't say wedded because, you know, weddings can end in divorce, but the women's struggle is inseparable from the struggle for socialism. And the struggle for socialism, moving beyond capitalism, is inseparable from feminism and the liberation from stereotypes of gender roles. The history of modern Western feminism is usually split into 3 different time periods or waves. each with slightly different aims based upon the prior progress or lack thereof. The first wave feminism was a demand for abstract equality before the law. This had been promised in the Republican constitutions that emerged from Enlightenment revolutions from the 1700s on. By the mid-1800s in the United States, the vote had been extended to men, colored men, and men who did not own property. Yet, despite being oppressed before such males, and despite fighting to abolish slavery, women were still denied the vote well after 1900. Starting in New Zealand in the late 1800s, first wave feminism overturned inequalities fixed in law, particularly the exclusion of women from voting. And in 1921, as we learned at the screening of Iron-Jawed Angels, President Wilson stopped opposing female votes in recognition of women's patriotic war sacrifices, hoping for their votes, of course. Now, this first wave was almost entirely spent by 1947, when women got the vote in Mexico, or at least in municipal elections. And then in '53 in Mexico, women were allowed to vote in national elections. So second wave feminism is often dated to the 60s and 70s and 80s. And that, of course, is something that I think all of us remember. It broadened the debate to include unequal gender norms and the role of women in society, especially their unequal treatment in the workplace. Women also struggled for equality in the home, insisting that men share the housework and child rearing. Remember all those debates about, you can do the dishes. Third wave feminism is dated from, there is something called third wave feminism, it's dated from around 1990, and it's sort of a continuation of second wave feminism, or sort of corrects some of the things that second wave feminism left out. It focuses on lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual rights, identity politics, postmodernism, coloniality, and queer theory. All of these things were emphasized to sort of make up for what had appeared to be a bias towards white, middle-class, straight women in second wave feminism. So third wave feminism did correct some of those shortcomings, and it also opened an awareness onto the global women's struggles. That is to say, the different yet related struggles of women around the world. But it did not identify basic dynamics of women's oppression, and it didn't offer any global remedies. So what is called third wave feminism was and is sort of a footnote to second wave feminism, rather than being a third attempt to solve the basic problem. And we can uncover those roots only by situating all three waves, or 2.5 waves, in the broader history of capitalism as a whole. And doing so will bring the patriarchal capitalism into view as a single system. So we're going to look back at the history of capitalism, where it got started, what is capitalism, and how did it get started? And how does women's labor, especially their unwaged labor in the home, how does that fit into this? Well, the essential features of capitalism, we can start with David Schweikert's definition. Capitalism is an economic system in which commodities that meet needs are sold on more or less open markets. The sellers are the private owners of the means of production and seeking to profit from production. They have purchased the different factors of production, like raw materials and labor power, that has been hired for a fixed period. And of course, we all know that the claim of capitalism is that in the long run, the market will get needed goods into needy hands, quote, as if by the action of an unseen hand. Well, I haven't seen that hand, and I don't think any of us have. So this raises two obvious questions. How did private ownership of the means of production come about? How did capital get accumulated? And why would anyone voluntarily hire themselves out to owners of the means of production? Why would anyone yield up control of and benefit from their own work? The capitalists don't really tell us much about that, do they? Capitalism, of course, grew out of feudalism, and before there was wage labor, there was, of course, labor. Everybody worked. Everybody worked to reproduce life. I mean, that's what life is all about. Fixing meals, cleaning your clothes, cleaning your body, cleaning your children's bodies, your parents and grandparents if they need help. You know, all of life is about work. And until there was waged labor, it didn't occur to anyone that women's work in the home was less valuable than men's work out in the forest cutting down trees or killing animals. So it was only with the advent of waged labor that things got turned around, and it was seen that it was considered that women's work, which then of course became housework and child rearing, was seen as less valuable than men's work. And the wage that one goes to work for is just enough to purchase the commodities that workers need in order to reproduce their labor power overnight and over the generations. Well, it's almost what one needs, probably less and less. What the worker produces, of course, is worth more than what he or she is paid, and the owner gets to keep that difference. So why would anybody go voluntarily engage in wage labor? I mean, it used to be considered a terrible tragedy if you had to actually sell your labor. So let's look at the worker's motivation. So if the worker has been dispossessed of the normal means of production, then he has nothing to live on but his labor power. If he wants to live, he must sell his labor power. This is part of what Adam Smith and Marx call primitive accumulation, meaning accumulation of land and labor in the hands of a private owner, who as such becomes a capitalist and a member of the bourgeois class. All value comes from either nature, land, and or human labor. So if you can separate individuals from land, then you can force them into wage labor. And of course, that's what we see playing out across the third world these days. In England and France, the enclosures expropriated much of the peasantry. And this progressively transformed a population of peasants and farmers and artisans, people who had some access to the means of their reproduction, into people who were completely dispossessed, who were made into proletarian workers. So how did this get started? Well, there were two preconditions. The act of enclosing or fencing off previously commonly held lands, forests, rivers, lakes, plains, the air, and devaluing women's labor. These are the two necessary preconditions. So the enclosures started much earlier, but reached their highest point starting in the middle of the 16th century. Enclosure was a claim on the land for one's own personal use. In making such a claim, one presumed no one had previously done so. I mean, we're all familiar with the white man coming to the so-called New World and going, gee, there's nobody here. I'll claim it for the King of Spain. Um, and if one left some of this enclosed land for other people's use, then it was sort of, you presumptively earned a right to own it, to benefit exclusively from it, and to let your children inherit it. Okay, one word for this is mixing one's labor with the land. If you work the land, it's yours. Another word for it is theft, stealing the commons. But that was back in the 16th century, 17th century. So the enclosures, by enclosing the land, this created in one act the two key interdependent elements of this process of capital accumulation, which is to say, capital on the one side, land, and labor on the other. And enclosing means primarily to arrogate use of previously common property for the gain of the new possessor. But since this exclusion of other people would leave the owner with no way to cultivate the land, okay, so now you've enclosed the land, now what do? You've got to work it. Whoops. Oh, work. So you have to allow the newly proletarianized farmers back onto the land so that they'll work it. And if the person admitted to the terrain would recognize the wage as full payment for his time, he would be admitted, so he could come back and work and get a wage rather than getting the product of his labor. And these rights were, of course, included in the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forests. The people who were dispossessed waged a very, bloody struggle over the legitimacy of this enclosure. The enclosures trampled on the farmers' historic claims to the commons that had been passed down to them. And they had been recognized in agreements such as the Magna Carta. But the villagers lost the struggle. And with the passage of the Enclosures Act by Parliament in 1773, the illegitimate act of enclosure was legalized. So capitalism has since been built not just on the act of enclosing common lands, but on the legalization of that act. And this same principle behind enclosures still operates today, although it has never really gained legitimacy. The other aspect is labor and the devaluing of women's labor. And this was a conjoint process with the enclosures that was overlooked by Marx. Now, a lot of the ideas that I'm discussing come from my reading of Sylvia Federici's book, Caliban and the Witch, and her work on the wages for housework movement, and the work of a lot of other feminists like Nancy Holmstrom and Julie Graham. And the struggle for, the explicit struggle for socialism starting in the 19th century, then throughout the 20th century, sort of overlooked the role of women and the role of women's labor. And it overlooked the struggle for equality, women's struggles for equality. The men in the Communist Party would get together and say, look at that, the women are out there complaining about they don't have the right to birth control. What are they talking about? So trying to incorporate women's struggles into the overall struggle for socialism has been a long struggle. Marx completely overlooked the witch hunts, which was a major war on women, where hundreds of thousands of women were arrested, tortured, killed, burned on village squares. He also passed over the role of the legalization that penalized all forms of contraception and control over reproduction. Capitalism sort of looks at the body of women and procreation as a aspect of the production of the workforce, and in that sense, it's sort of, women's bodies kind of become turned into machines for reproducing workers, and it's sort of seen as, well, that's not really work, having children, raising children, and it sort of becomes invisible, and we hear every day, gee, only 35% of the women in such and such a place work. Excuse me? All women work, of course. All poor people work. Everybody works, well, except for the wealthy. So the development of capitalism, with the development of capitalism, women's bodies are turned into machines, and which explain why there was such fierce and stringent laws against women. And they instituted, even capital punishment for any kind of abortion. So it came down as a war of the state against women. So the enclosures and this devalorization or devaluing of women and women's work were both interdependent and intertwined. And there's an interconnection there. So what we have called the enclosures principle is at the heart of patriarchal capitalism itself, inasmuch as Sylvia shows us, it is built on the devaluation, exclusion, and superexploitation of women. But the same principle of enclosure is operated in the unfolding of capitalism as the entire biosphere, the atmosphere, the earth, and all life on the planet is enclosed within the system of capital accumulation. And it's been all of nature, all of the commons, air, water, land, natural resources, has sort of been demoted to the status of garbage can for patriarchal capitalism. You think of all the waste that's put into the air, the water, Now, in feudal times, any peasant could enter onto the Lord's land, assuming that he or she accepted the Lord's sovereignty and protection. But all of that ended with capitalism. And with capitalism, everyone was, just on their own. As Margaret Thatcher said, there is no such thing as society. They're only individuals. And a whole system of a whole legal system of equal rights was built on this shared exclusion. Historically, until recently, socialists have not considered that fighting women's oppression is a central aspect of the struggle against capitalism. But that day is ending because many people, including many women, consider patriarchy as a separate system from capitalism. Women's issues continue to be segregated in emancipatory movements as being dealt with only by women and failing to take women's issues seriously. But we know that boys and men need to fight gender stereotypes as much as girls and women do, and everyone needs to fight for better working conditions and to fight for the right to control over the product of one's labor. Capitalism is essentially patriarchal, as Sylvia Federici shows, Laura Carlson, a lot of people. The relationship between feminist political practice and the struggle to transform capitalist institutions should be intimately connected to each other at every step of the struggle. Now, last month, when I was talking about oil debt and the U.S. military, I mentioned a very important survey of people's struggles around the world. In this study, the researchers contend that there are 4 categories of struggle being waged around the planet. Number 1 is the struggle for any kind of meaningful democracy. That is to say, people want the end result of the political process to actually reflect what the majority of the population wants. We all know in the United States, since 1950, something like 60% of the US population has wanted to have a single-payer system. Well, why don't we have it? Oh, we don't have a democracy. Is that the problem? Yeah, that's the problem. The second category of things is the struggle against austerity. That is to say, against government policies that lower the standard of living, but only of the poor and the middle classes. You know, austerity doesn't affect the rich and the super rich. It just affects the poor and the middle classes. The third aspect of, or the third thing that people are protesting is the fact that governments are doing absolutely nothing about global warming. And then the last thing is the struggle against impunity and disrespect for human rights, as we have seen in recent police shootings all over the United States and the Ayotzinapa 43. So in other words, I mean, these are, you know, this is a survey of all of the demonstrations between 2006 and 2013 around the world, and they all fall into one of these four categories of complaints, which is to say that we have a worldwide demand to stop the real life results of capitalism. Real life results of capitalism for the vast majority of people around the world are not wanted. They're rejected. We have politics and government that is bought by the billionaires. We have austerity imposed on the poor and middle class, lack of action on global warming due to capital's control of energy. You know, the rich people control all of the energy. A lack of respect for human rights and the rule of law due to corruption and the capture of the judicial system. In short, you know, capitalism has set the world on fire. We are in the abyss, as Gustavo Esteva reminded us this summer. And people just want care. You know, they just want care. Food, shelter, healthcare, education. There's somewhere between 22 trillion and 32 trillion in offshore banking accounts. Now, if we want to think of this in terms of money, there's plenty of money. There's no reason why people cannot have a decent standard of living. So I think that the next wave of feminism will be an eco-socialist feminism where we fight for and achieve the respect for and fulfillment of needs and care for the planet and for our environment. And if we don't succeed, we're going to die. So, another cheerful note from us. So I've tried to, show how capitalism and the oppression of women have developed together, and that the development of capitalism necessitated the oppression of women and the devaluing of women's labor, and that it didn't necessarily have to end up this way. There were a lot during the Middle Ages, believe it or not. We think of the Middle Ages as just, a bunch of people out in the farm, fields. But there were lots and lots of struggles over hundreds of years. And people were trying to build different kinds of societies and more egalitarian societies. And things could have gone differently. But, somehow the church, I think, managed to separate men and women with sexism. They managed to, divide the working class. Then I think of second wave feminism and women's interest in going into the workforce in the 70s and 80s, when maybe we should have all been saying, wait a minute. Right now, we have families with one person engaged in wage labor. Now you want two of us engaged in wage labor, plus you still have to do all the housework? Capitalism can't possibly pay for all of the care that people need. Or they don't want to. They refuse to. So, you know, things didn't inevitably get to where they are today. And we've got to do something to change where we are today at the peril of, if not our lives, certainly our children and our grandchildren. So, thank you.
So you can answer questions, comments.
Well, since you were talking about it from a historical perspective, if we go beyond or backwards, not to the Middle Ages, but looking at other cultures and thinking about how, you know, you have matriarchies, the female goddesses that, you know, were wiped out, I don't know, 2,000 years ago, and how this is just a problem, don't you think, that goes beyond capitalism, that women having their babies being, quote, weaker, allowed men to simply take hold of, you know, maybe you can finish that sentence for me, but it just seems like it's a bigger issue. I'd like to hear what you say about that.
Well, yeah, of course it is. And it's true that the matriarchal societies, there are few remnants still remaining, were replaced by patriarchal societies way before there was capitalism. And this is something that's been discussed a lot, needless to say. And I can't possibly sum up all of the arguments, or even the conclusion, really, because sexism does predate capitalism.
So it seems like it's a big battle. If we're going to have a system that can reverse things, it's got to be at so many levels. And I just really agree with you that it's going to be in our hands as women and men to
Of
try
course.
to save this planet, too. I mean, this is
Of
really
course.
a huge challenge.
Of course it is. And actually, it's a challenge that needs something as big as the Reformation of the 16th century to reverse it, or the Enlightenment of the 18th century to reverse it. And I think one of the things that has come about recently is that all of these different struggles, the struggle for the environment, for struggles for human rights, and the struggles for animal rights, and the labor rights, and gay rights, women's rights. Well, you know, the struggle for the vote, well, we've seen where that has gotten us. You know, that hasn't helped. But all of these struggles are seen as being actually just one big struggle. And it's one struggle against the real life results of the economic system that we have right now.
I just wanted to probably ask you, or to comment on Naomi Klein's conclusion, more or less, that addressing the disaster of climate change will address a whole lot of other social problems at the same time by coming together. You know,
Oh,
could you
absolutely.
comment on that?
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, all of these struggles are related. So addressing the issue of the inequality of women and people of color, that also brings about, oh yeah, the environment, because where is all of the toxic stuff dumped? You know, it's dumped on peoples of color and other societies. So yes, of course, I think they're all related. I don't think one can necessarily privilege one over the other, except that we do see that the climate change is something that is right now impacting us, and right now, you know, sort of in our face. Yeah?
Betty and Cliff?
Well, there's that and that woman in the back. I don't know her.
Margaret?
Yeah.
So Margaret, Betty, and Cliff,
Oh,
how's that?
You know, this is just an observation, not a question, but climate change doesn't discriminate against the rich and the poor, or between the rich and the poor. I mean, the part I don't get about all of these money-grubbing gazillionaires who couldn't give a shit is the fact that, you know, when the earth falls apart, it's gonna fall on their head as along with everybody else. Like, they just don't get it. Do you understand the point I'm making?
Absolutely.
I just,
Absolutely.
it's the absolute blindness that boggles my mind in all of that. And I just,
Well, this is a very
I mean, do they
important...
really think that just because they're rich, they'll be saved somehow?
This is a very important question, because basically what you're asking is, you know, isn't it these greedy people who have caused the problem? Well, why do the super wealthy do everything they possibly can to bring on the catastrophes of climate change as quickly as possible? Which is what they're doing.
Yeah, well,
Why do they do that? It's because that's the whole system. There's no way they can not do that. If they challenge climate change, then they're going to be challenging what keeps the U.S. military running, which is oil. They're going to be challenging the ability of the United States to impose its will around the world and keep the super rich in the position that they're in. So they have to oppose any action about climate change, even though it's going to bring about their own doom.
demise.
Yeah.
If not theirs, the demise of their children.
Their children. Yeah. That would be my answer.
Betty,
Betty?
Cliff, and then Georgiana.
Well, just on a totally facetious note, this morning on my, what do you call that stuff, the news comes every day? Internet, anyway, no, that one, and Facebook. There's a cure for all of this inequality for women, because in the U.S. there's a proposal to put women's faces on the $20 bill. We're going to be back into the capitalistic run all over again. And there'll be famous women, but I was wondering why they just chose the 20. Why not the $1 million
That was Susan B. Anthony, come on.
Or the $1 trillion coin that Congress could mint. Yeah, you know, all of this junk that they come up with to confuse people. Yeah, Cliff?
Cliff, Georgiana, Harriet, and Rohan.
Okay, to talk about women's labor as unwaged in capitalism suggests, and some have proposed this, that women's labor ought to be waged, that they ought to be paid for that. But now, doesn't that in effect accept the logic of capitalism that sees something of value only if it is made into a commodity that can be bought and sold and thus the profit made from? You know, in a sense, the unwaged labor of the household is a carryover from a pre-capitalist times. And that leads me then to the question of, under socialism, would household labor be waged or not? Or would it be outside of a market commodity economy, as presumably all the rest of labor ought to be in socialism?
Well, when I first met Sylvia back in the 70s, I asked her, what do you think about the wages for housework movement? She says, oh, yes, that is so important, but it shouldn't be wages that are paid by a husband. It should be wages that are paid by the state or all the corporations together, because women are doing the work of raising the children who will be the next generation of workers. Well, you're right, we don't want labor to be commodified, which is why we've been promoting the idea of cooperatives, where all of the owners are workers and all of the workers are also owners. No one gets a wage, they get an anticipation of their share of the profits. And frankly, under socialism, why are we working 12 hours a day? Not that we are, we're retired, thank goodness. But our kids, if they have jobs, are working 12 hours a day, or they're working at 2 or 3 different jobs 12 hours a day. Or they're contractors who are doing little contract jobs for this company and that company. But they're working all the time. What we should have is a society where people work, 2 or 3 or 4 hours a day. And then everyone can be involved in housework is, hey, that's taking care of yourself. That's taking care of your children, that's cleaning up your house, that's cooking food. That's what is, more of a pleasure for people, to care for other people. So I think that under socialism, people will work far less at reproducing the objects, the goods and the services that we need to live, and will spend far more of their time caring for people. That's what I think. That's what I hope.
I just wanted to add a couple of comments to your comment about the greedy rich and what in the world are they thinking. 2 things. One, I think it's just human nature that we get up, think tomorrow's going to be like it is today. I think that pervades all of us and has probably forever. But the other thing, 3 or 4 years ago, when the greedy rich were not as much as on the horizon as they are now, I saw this article with photographs of these giant ships being built that would have everything on them, including gardens and stuff. So it's that rich were buying and ordering to have built as the way they would survive. Now, I don't, they still have to breathe air, I think. But other than that, like food, water, etc., and maybe having all their cash on board, I don't know. But that was shocking to me, and that was 3 or 4 years ago.
Desalinization plants on their boats, I guess.
I don't remember the details.
Yeah, and recently I saw articles about people buying, huge farms in New Zealand and, sort of remote places around the planet. And then, of course, there's always the science fiction dystopia of, they're actually all planning to go live on the moon or Mars or something like that. Fine, good riddance, Well, people always think that there's an individual solution, and there's not. There's only a collective solution. And we have to all work together to bring about a collective solution. Because that's the only way we're going to get through this, is together.
Harriet and then Rohan. And then I'm going to say something.
I was going to respond to the point too about, don't they get it, these wealthy people? They get it, but they're in denial. If everybody's this, the individual is a system, the mental, the body, the society is a system, and when you hear things you don't want, and you go into denial, and therefore it's not going to happen, and I think even Klein in her book lay some of the blame at the feet of the environmentalists who were saying, not to worry, we can cure this, we can control it, we know how to handle it. So when you're told that's what you really want to hear. And so if that's not working, it's going to take maybe after the Reformation and Enlightenment, maybe you're going to have destruction. That'll be the next movement before people will sort of get it, you know.
That is the movement we have.
That things are going to have to change. But at the moment, I will be okay.
Mohan?
That's actually the point that I was going to make. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's a little hard over here to hear some of you, so it's easier for me to speak when I'm standing. I want to first thank you, Betsy, for your skilled way of pulling all these different themes together. I'm very impressed, and I wish I had more of your knowledge, all the books you've read and the quotations you can make, because when I speak to so many people, they're not only in denial, they don't have much information. The media keeps them from knowing what's really going on. And when I try to explain what I'm beginning to understand, I don't have quite enough background. So I'm very grateful for Naomi Klein, for all the videos, all the lectures we've had here in San Miguel. And I'm very thankful that we have a community to help to support one another, because it's a very lonely place to stand up and speak your truth and have people attack you. I've been there a lot over the years. And now when I go home, first step I have to make is to gather some like-minded people together and form ourselves better, reach out and speak to others and help to educate people. It's an overwhelming proposition. I think the only way I can survive it is by surrounding myself with more like-minded, well-informed people such as yourself. So thank you, and thanks to all the women.
Thank you, Roanna.
I just wanted to comment because I've been thinking a lot about this and it's been bothering me. Yesterday we showed a beautiful movie, Girl Rising, which showed how, girls are being, there's so much violence against girls, emotional, sexual, physical violence against girls all over the world. And it was a movie done by NGOs that are doing good. They're helping some girls get educated, and we see how girls overcome great odds in each of these developing countries, India, Haiti, Africa, and Ethiopia. What bothered me, though, through the whole movie is there was no talk of, and that's why I was so glad, Betsy's talking tomorrow, no talk about, well, what is the economic, political system that's causing this to happen?
Yes.
And it's great these NGOs are doing what they're doing, but it's just a drop in the bucket. And they said things like, they gave all these horrifying statistics about girls, and then they said, and if we educate so many girls, the GDP will increase. And I was horrified. I go, do we want the GDP to increase? With climate change and, this is an educational film, and all the women were talking about it, and about, women in Kotex, and that's fine and that's great, but it really disturbed me that nobody talked about what you're talking about, the system that's causing this. And then they talked about with the right kind of education, and I wanted to know, well, what's the right kind of education for these girls? So it's a beautiful film, but it left me disturbed that, these questions weren't being addressed.
Absolutely. Well, let's all feel good about capitalism, because if we just, give a little more money to Mujeres en Cambio and Jóvenes Adelante, then all these girls will get educated, and, education doesn't do it all. But you're absolutely right, and that's why, as Georgianne pointed out a couple of weeks ago, there are environmental groups that are not environmentally conscious. There are lots of women's groups which are not feminist, who don't see the disproportionate disadvantage that women have, or that they suffer. And without an analysis of how capitalism is driving all of this, you're never going to get to a solution. Because we know the solution is not education. The woman in the far back, and then you, I'm sorry.
No matter what system you propose, there's always corruption, and so that's the problem I have with, proposing, say, socialism. It will work in an ideal world with ideal people, but has there ever been a socialist society that has really been successful? And capitalism also has its positives, like it definitely has incentives for creativity. And the person that is willing to put their money on the line and risk losing it, I agree, is going to be the winner, like Bill Gates. But how do you get your Bill Gates, the kind of drive that's needed, the kind of, in a system where you say, well, everybody's value is equal, and therefore, if you want to be well educated or work hard, that's fine, and if you choose not to, that's also fine.
I think that, I wanted to emphasize that what we do at the Center for Global Justice is we focus on change that we think is transformative. It's sort of like the difference between giving someone something to eat or giving them some seeds and a hoe. You need to give people or provide them with the ability to change their own situation rather than just changing it for them. And that's why we always say that we support change and not charity. And we hate to call ourselves an NGO, but can't do anything about that.
Since Georgianne supplied us with over half the films we saw this month, and Girl Rising is one of them, I wanted to let her respond.
Well, the same thing, when I heard the GDP thing, I went, oh God. But I will tell you that if we did not have the climate change, which we do, which makes everything else.
It changes everything.
Changes everything. I do believe that the slow way, if it were possible, to change things is a girl getting an education. And I'll tell you why. Because, as you know, I started Mujeres en Cambio, so I'm a little bit leaning in that direction. But I'll say the same thing that women have asked me. They say, those schools are so terrible. They are. What jobs do they get when they get out? That's right, it's limited. But I'll tell you what it does do for girls around the world. If you can get a girl to 18, and so far, we've got 900 girls in the Ranchos, to 18 without having a baby, regardless of what the education is or before that, because she gets status in her neighborhood by getting a scholarship. And that adds to her self-esteem. So what I am saying is if we had time, which we don't, but if we did, girls getting to 18 and having something under their belt for choices.
Oh, absolutely.
Then I think that would, girls, that means if we had time, going into government, all the things. I do think that is the slower way to affect change. I just think it's pretty secondary, as is everything else right now.
Well, I agree with you completely. And has there ever been a socialist system that worked very well? Well, frankly, all there is just the struggle.
Yeah.
Throughout history, life has always been a struggle, and a struggle to make things better. And we're never going to get to heaven. It just doesn't exist.
I'll get back to you, Sally and Ed, and then you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what we're talking about education. I think education is really important, and that's really what global justice does. Educate the public, but
that shows how important we think it is.
Yeah, but it's a matter of education for what? For what purpose? Educating girls is, of course we need to do that. We need to educate properly, I think, in our universities.
I mean, there's a lot left out in our education, in our public education. So education is really important, but again, for what? For what purpose?
For social change.
This one, you've had your hand up for a while, and then Ed, and then Georgia.
I just want to comment on another, and this is all kind of contrarian, but first of all, if I was going to have my picture on something, I would want it to be the $20 bill, because I think that's the most value, that's the most used. I definitely agree with education. It's not necessarily in a formal setting, but just among ourselves, we start thinking, we pass on, everyone else starts thinking. So I think education is the key. Thirdly, and this is going to be the most contrarian, but I really have a problem with us and them, no matter whether it's the big multi-corporations or the big money makers. There's just an inertia with them. That's where they're going, so that's the way we're going to continue. But we have to look at ourselves, and I think, I don't unplug my appliances, I buy things in plastic containers, I do a minimum of recycling, a minimum conscious. But my feeling is that if we really commit ourselves and we build a strong base of commitment, instead of thinking it's going to happen from top down, I think we build a base that's going to have momentum going bottoms up. And if we have enough of a commitment that spreads and gets strong, then I think that's going to build up and build up and build up. And maybe we'll get people at the top eventually who have that consciousness, who come from that. And the last thing is, you said people don't want to work for someone else. Well, I do, and I don't want to be an entrepreneur. I want to go to work, get a steady paycheck, know I'm going to be taken care of, and I'm happy for the administrator to make a little more money, certainly not the greed paradigm we have. But I have to really disagree with you there.
Okay, so,
Who was next?
Ed?
I agree with everything you say. And I know most of the world just wants to go to work and get their paycheck, but a lot of, you have to always consider the alternative. What's the alternative to that, to taking some initiative yourself?
okay,
Georgianne was,
well,
I
Ed,
think.
Georgianne.
Oh, yeah,
and this
Ed,
woman
okay.
here, and Harriet, and Sally, and Chris. Who can remember? Go on. Go on.
Hi, after Laura Carlson's wonderful talk, and we were leaving, I approached her and asked her a question. And that is, with all these diverse groups of women finally getting their voice, and we heard that on Monday at the Occupy meeting, everybody has a great need to improve things worldwide, especially topics that you're talking about. I said, I asked her, how long would it take, you think, to get the groups of women, just in Mexico, to form critical mass to where their numbers can reach out and articulate the change that is needed so that women can get the rights and equality. And she says she doesn't see it in the near future. I think one of the problems is you can articulate all of the problems that have occurred in the past, in the history of the women's movement, but until you get that one or two unifying messages that create critical mass so that women are heard in force, nothing will come to fruition. Gandhi was able to create critical mass, so he was listened to. And I think that is the nature of what we have to deal with here. We know the problems. Worldwide education is pretty much on its way for women, especially through things like Khan Academy and little tablets that we can provide children with. And if we all mentor a person, that helps too. But until critical mass of the voices come together, unfortunately, whether it's climate control, women's rights, or all the things that we agree on, we'll never see any solutions. So I'm giving you another topic to talk about, and that is put the cap on capitalism.
Right. Right. Well, you're right. We know the problems, but we also know the solutions. It's just that we cannot get them implemented.
We need critical mass.
Yeah, I know. And I think we're getting closer. I think we're getting closer. Who was next in
Well,
line?
let's hear from this one because she hasn't
Okay.
spoken.
Well, I was just thinking, I completely agree with you, because I was thinking along the same lines. I don't understand this we they, because I am part of it. I mean, I'm from an immigrant family. The richest person in the 1% in my family is a Hungarian who, grew up under horrible circumstances and is a multimillionaire. Do I blame this person? No. The most millionaires in the United States are Russians, and then very heavily immigrants who had no choice or no opportunity to be educated in their own country. And the book that had all the belongings in their houses put out on the front lawns and compared it over different cultures. I mean, I would be in that American culture. I don't have as, huge suburban house, but I have a lot. So I agree with you that there has to be from the bottom up, but that system, if you can compare how much I had growing up in the 50s from this poor immigrant family to now, I mean, it's incredible. And that system has gone all over the world. I mean, if I travel to Indonesia, they want all the things that we have in the States or in Canada, in the Western world. So I think it has to be from the bottom up, and also that there has to be some crisis, just as psychologically we do not change without a crisis. We are not going to change our system without a crisis where we are really forced to go solar and this and that, and so I don't really buy into that we they, because I know those people in the 1%, and they're just like us, only they've had poorer backgrounds and have worked harder. So
I'm not talking about people. I'm talking about an economic system. It's very different.
I mean, the economic system is composed of people and their values and where they put the time and energy. And those who've grown up under repressive systems are the best capitalists. Anyway.
I think
Anna hasn't said anything, and then the lady in the back has only made one comment. Or Georgia.
I wanted to follow up on the films and the Hujiteka and the matriarchal cultures before we got too far away from it. To me, the value, yes, there are remnants, but all over the world. That shows us before a patriarchal and hierarchical system. We saw from the Hujitekas, that's the way our human nature can unfold when not having this unnatural system imposed upon us for so long. Does it mean we're going to all go back to small communities at the fringes of nowhere? No, we're not, but it shows us that that is within our human capacity to do. And in fact, it is more natural.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, and did the women work and the men work? Yeah, everybody had their roles, but they sure had a lot of fiesta time too, which is natural. So I just wanted to make my statement about the value of knowing there are matriarchal cultures is to show us another way our human nature unfolds.
And if we didn't have the mass media that we have, maybe people around the world wouldn't want all of the plastic junk that we've got. Okay,
I'll let you call on
Honey?
people.
I just wanted to add that one of the ways that I felt personally I can make a difference, and I think a lot of people feel this inspires them, gives them hope, a sense of some kind of light, at the end of the tunnel, has been to really focus on smaller communities. Where I live in the Berkshires as well as here, we've got E.F. Schumacher, and small is beautiful. Maybe that sounds like a cliche now, but it's really amazing how in certain neighborhoods and communities when you really have this initiative and people come together to create, more solar panels, they get the government involved. Like in Massachusetts, we were able last year to do it at a much cheaper rate. And this is where I feel like with the small communities and then the larger global communication that's going on, people can work as models and help each other out. So do you feel this is also one of our, there's so many different steps. I mean, it's not like, and I'm sure Naomi Klein says this as well, we're not going to just do it with education alone, and I'm totally in favor of women and men getting the right education. I think only that's one of the major ways, but different approaches, whatever can work, either on a rural, small scale, or maybe in cities when you have neighborhoods and they decide to have be more self-sufficient, basically, more sustainable, to use that term. So
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
my own feeling of some kind of hope, and otherwise you get totally despair, or
Well,
depressed.
we have to create the sort of social infrastructure, the human relationships that will make it possible for us to get through the crises and cataclysms that are coming.
Yeah, that's
And solar panels on your house is one way to start. Harriet, Sally, and then you?
In respect to education for what? Public education started so there was an educated citizenry that would understand the government and be able to read the press, and that the purpose of the press was not to inform, but was to give a reason for people to get together and talk and discuss. Education, aside from enhancing one's self-image, is also, it allows people to realize that this isn't the way it has to be. That was, when they first started talking about women's rights and changing women's roles, it was, but this is the natural way. It's always been like this. And if that's what you, and there must be something wrong with you if you want to change the way it's always been. But if you educate people, and especially girls, and it doesn't have to be this way, and there is nothing wrong with you for wanting something different, then that is a great value, I think, to education.
Sally?
Yeah, I just want to emphasize again, I think that education about, that it's important to teach people that the system that we're under doesn't work for us. We have to change that system. That kind of education, I think, is fundamental and must be done. And I just want to make a comment. I'm sorry. Iman. It's great. People have jobs and they go to work and get a paycheck. But of course, I would prefer that we have cooperatives where people own the means of production and benefit from what they produce. I think it's really important to think about, people are going to work now and they're getting paychecks, hopefully, if they're not unemployed. But what are they producing? And how does that production affect the climate, affect the whole planet? I think it's important to think about what we're producing and its effects. I mean, all this junk, plastic, for example, that you mentioned.
Oh, absolutely.
We have to think about that.
All the natural resources that go into creating all this plastic junk that we don't need, that's totally wasteful. Then you think of all the natural resources that go into making fighter jets and bombs and all of the military stuff. I mean, none of that's necessary. And in fact, it's all harmful. So yeah, we do. And then, you can go from there to eating meat. It takes so much water to make a gallon of hamburger. A pound of hamburger. So we have to start thinking about that. But I just remembered that Chris had a question.
Oh, I was going to make a statement that educating women, like Georgianne said, so they get to be 18 before they start a family, is the greatest value of education in the global South. And then the other thing is that the military actually latched on to the fact that they could sell some of the things they've done in Afghanistan as liberating the Afghani women, when in fact it's a very small minority in Kabul. And the majority of women in Afghanistan are still living like they always have, so, except with more bombs coming off. So basically, it's a two-edged spear, you know, women's education and women's, that even the military can use it, and that's the bad edge, I guess.
I wanted to say something about models that go on what you're saying, and that keeps me, I always say, from jumping off my balcony. There are models, and you know, again, the Center for Global Justice teaches a lot of this, and where I've gotten many of my sources. I'd encourage people not to just read mainstream media. There's an incredible amount of information. Even Naomi Klein's book, she has a website connected to it called Beautiful Solutions. You know, I look at, let's say, Richmond, California. It's all the Green Party. They've been able to stop, you know, Chevron. Is it Chevron or Exxon or one
Chevron.
of those big oil companies from, you know, getting their own people elected. The Zapatista community I've learned so much about. You know, I hear from so many people, oh, they're so poor. Oh, yeah, they struggle in poverty, but they're trying to create a society. And there's a lot of equality there of women. And I've read articles by Chris Hedges and Rebecca Solnit, you know, Western writers about the Zapatista community and the more equal roles of women. And there's just thousands of examples. Gar Alperovitz is even David Korten, who's more penny capitalism, but they all have models that we could follow on a larger scale, local models. And I'd encourage people to explore those. Right? And also Naomi Klein talks about, and I like to think about this, we need to build and resist. So we need to build these local models and resist this huge global capitalist system that's destroying us. So those are my thoughts. But focusing on other models locally that we could use on a larger scale.
Yeah, and the truth of the matter is, if women want a better deal, they have to be at the forefront. They have to stop being victims. And a good example of this was, I forget, was 10 years ago in New York City, when there was a lot of violence against women. There was a movement called Take Back the Night,
Yes.
and women marched.
Yes.
And it gives a sense of awareness to everyone, men and women, that women are tired of being afraid of going out at night. You know, I love things like that, because that's what women need to do. They need to not depend on men to give them rights. They've got to demand the rights.
That's still going on.
Oh, yeah.
I want to stand up to say this because I want to emphasize it. And just to say, as a summary for this month, it's great you did this today, Betsy, to give a framework to put all of this in. And as my own personal summary for the month, because I've been involved, like half of us here, practically every event, every day, is I want to emphasize that all of us sitting right here, right now, particularly half of us will be going home to other communities. We are a tremendous resource because we are older and have time, and we aren't there with, like, the kids or grandkids working three shifts on, and we have knowledge. So I just want to sort of say, I feel like all of us have participated in this month, and the excitement and the cohesion and the feelings, that's the feeling I want to say I've gotten, is to take that back to where you, if you're here, we're still here, but if you're going home somewhere, take it with you and realize that you are a tremendous resource.
And all of the documentaries that we show are listed on our webpage. All of these talks that we do are on our webpage. The video is, and we have a lot of the text, in print form on our webpage, so you can, share these things. If you can't find them on our webpage, call Olivia, the administrator. I have a question for the guys here, and I would like to ask, what does feminism mean for you?
Oh,
Yeah, Rich.
well, I grew up with a mother who was in the, what was it called, United American University Women, when they all stayed at home with all their degrees. I mean, my mom had a couple degrees. And so I always felt like I was brought up a feminist, And in fact, in whichever stage that was in the 70s, in the 60s, I felt like there was a lot of education of men that needed to be done, but somehow I felt like I was a little bit at an advantage for having a mother who was more conscious of how women had, even educated women, had been sort of pushed down, told just to be home bodies, So, yeah.
Yeah, Cliff?
For a lot of people, feminism simply means equal rights for women, that women ought to have the same opportunities and the same rights in society as anyone else. And of course, the struggle for that is an important struggle that has moved things forward. But I think that for me at least, feminism has a deeper meaning. And that is rooted in the recognition that all of us, men and women alike, have both a feminine side and a masculine side. We have a side that is capable of nurturing, capable of cooperating, sensitive to the needs of others, etc. And we all have a side that is more competitive and that seeks to make a mark in the world in whatever way. We have both of those within us. Women, through their social role and also biologically, are more attuned to the feminine side, but men are capable of it as well. And so what feminism means to me is recognition of the two-sided nature of all humans, and a celebration of the value of the feminine side that is often devalued.
That's very essentialist, Cliff. I wouldn't put things that way, but I see feminism as a rejection of the stereotypes, the stereotypical roles that we're supposed to play. And, I remember all the arguments I had with my mom in the 60s and 70s about, well, why can't I wear pants to school? And, just silly things like that. But they're very important things, too. And the same way that I didn't want to accept the role of women as being mothers and homebodies and staying in the home and making, the greatest thing in life is to make a dinner that your husband enjoys. But I think that men, how many of the men in this room are macho assholes? That's one of the stereotypical roles of men. You're either a macho asshole or you're a faggot. And I don't really, men don't want those roles. And so that's the way I look at it. I've always thought that feminism was as much for men as for women. But Bob, James, Ed, would you like to add anything?
Faggots unite.
Yes!
Well, I'd have to say that if my wife was strictly a homebody and took care of all of my needs, I couldn't afford to pay her what she's worth.
Right.
That's number one. But number two, if people just give up the stereotypes and treat people equally with respect and civility, regardless of feminine versus masculine, white versus black, or whatever, then things would be a lot different. Just commenters, I agree with what, intellectually, what Cliff has said, but it's just one-on-one relationships. It's knowing that we each have our own values, our own strengths, and we play to the strengths. Is when we try to say, well, I'm better than you, that we get into trouble.
Georgianne?
I want to just say my own, I'd say personal experience of feminism, looking back before there was even a word, that I think applies to males and females. To me, feminism is resistance to what's imposed upon us.
Yeah. That's very good. Yeah.
I wanted to go back, and this is in a sense an answer to this question about feminism, but I wanted to go back to the film on Girls Rising. That was the name of it, right?
Yes, Girl Rise.
Yeah. And the comment you made about the GDP, and so, I mean, I could feel my teeth grinding a bit as well when I heard that, but I mean, they're making this documentary for a broad audience, so, you know, they're going to appeal to a variety of different arguments or different, you know, positions. But I think the greatest value in education for women is that it allows them an opportunity to live out their values and to exercise their values in a way that they would not normally be able to do. And the notion of women being perhaps more nurturing, tending to work more collectively, more cooperatively, more within community grassroots. All of those values, I think, can be given expression and can actually be lived out when women have an education. Because if they don't, and if they're suppressed, then where does that opportunity lie? It doesn't. And so I think it's absolutely critical.
Thank you. Other comments? Well, I want to thank Susan and Georgianne and all of the women and Amy and all the women who have worked so hard on putting together this month of programming. I think it's just been terrific. And I think we've all learned a lot from it, and I hope we'll do it next year too.